what we had in Ukraine, what we have in Ukraine is something, in the aftermath of World War II, the United States has never experienced, a real war. They had in Iraq, Afghanistan, they were dominant. They didn't have even the military to confront the United States. This is the first time they're fighting in Ukraine. Not just the United States, all NATO countries are fighting Russia in Ukraine. I think you've mentioned how Americans were involved in Ukraine, how the Europeans were involved. All together were somehow defeated by the Russian army. And how do you see the way that the Russian army, before starting the war in Ukraine, what we had about our assessment to talk with every military expert in the West, even in the alternative media, they were assessing the Russian army as a defensive force. Today's reality of the Russian army is totally different. They have been transforming for more than 4 years. Now we are getting to the 4 years of the conflict in Ukraine somehow, and it shows how the army has been changing and has been the experience they have, they had during, all along the conflict in Ukraine. How do you assess the Russian army today? The Russian army today compared to what it was before the conflict started, a defensive force right now, I would say the most experienced army on this planet as time
Yeah,
goes by.
well, there's several things that need to be considered. First of all, in the case of the Americans, Korea was the last real war the U.S. military fought, and took a lot of casualties. I won't consider Vietnam because Vietnam was a guerrilla warfare first and foremost. Though South Vietnam fell to a combined arms assault from North Vietnam, didn't fall to the Viet Cong. Viet Cong pretty much ceased to exist after the Tet Offensive, and the North Vietnamese pushed them into that Tet Offensive to get rid of them because they didn't want political competition when the war was over. As far as Russia, well, first of all, Russia had combat experience in Chechnya 1, Chechnya 2. Chechnya 2 was 1999. So this was 20 years. But for at least a lot of senior commanders and senior NCOs, they had seen combat before firsthand in those areas. So they weren't green. And this was not combat like what America fought in Afghanistan or in Iraq. This was, because the American approach, I mean, the standard operating procedure is if you start receiving sniper fire, you return fire in a general direction because it's pretty hard to tell exactly where the sniper fire comes from. You should look at your buddy's, which direction his brain or blood splatter was, and you kind of figure out what direction the bullet came from, and you just put down fire in that area, and then you break contact, and then you call in artillery or aviation to just wipe out the building that fire may have been coming from, and screw whoever's living in that building. It's their problem, not your problem. That's the standard approach. When the Russian army was fighting much closer and much harder in Chechnya 1 and 2, and more or less particularly Chechnya 2, trying to preserve the civilians. Though most of the civilians were evacuated out of Grozny by that point. Well, that's one. So at least a lot of the senior leadership had hands-on experience in house-to-house fighting and heavy fighting. Then there was Syria. And first of all, the first clue that should have hit Americans, but all these experts, is when they were predicting that the Russian army or the Russian military in Syria would run out of steam within 2 weeks to 4 weeks and then fall apart and they couldn't do their mission anymore. And yet 2-3 years later, they're still carrying out their mission every single day. That already should have sparked a lot of alarm bells in people's heads. And maybe we're underestimating things. It didn't. Don't worry about it. But what the Russian military was doing, by the way, at least on a limited basis, they were doing, particularly with fighter pilots and fighter bomber pilots, but ground assault aircraft pilots, but also with the infantry that was in there on a limited basis. But what they were actively doing was rotating people through, rotating commanders. So these guys got hands-on experience. That's to begin with. Now, the Russian army in 22 considered that the Ukrainian army, built by NATO, it was the biggest NATO army, even though it wasn't part of NATO, created and armed by NATO. And the Russian military that took it on in 22, as they were prepared to assault into Donbass, exterminate the population, and by their own documents, their plan was to hit into Volgograd, I'm sorry, not Volgograd, into Voronezh, and southeast into Rostov-on-Don to try to create a crisis in Russia and collapse the government by invading into Russia. They were preempted. There were already reconnaissance and sabotage units inside of Russia from the Ukrainians. They were surrounded and exterminated. So when Russia attacked against a force that was twice as big as it was. Let's just begin with that. So there was there were a lot of casualties on the Russian side at that time because they were fighting a foe that was twice as big. Two, Russia is still fighting with one arm and one leg tied behind its back. It's still in a relatively strict terms of what it can and cannot do. You have not seen carpet bombing. Russia could turn Kyiv into Gaza. Russia could turn any Ukrainian city into Gaza or into Mosul, if we want to do the American example of liberating a city, just wipe out half the population, destroy all the buildings, and put your flag on and say, liberate it. Russia isn't fighting like that. If Russia starts, and that was the message from Putin, by the way, to the Europeans. Don't think what we're doing here is what's going to happen to you. The velvet gloves are going to come off, and the steel gauntlets underneath are going to be the ones punching. So just consider that. But I don't think the Europeans really understand that. Well, some of them do. I know some people that do. I think that people in leadership in Europe understand that. Additionally, I mean, I'll give you this as a open secret only because it hasn't mentioned. In the first 3 months of combat operations, because negotiations were in process, the Russian army was not allowed to fire on the Ukrainians until they were fired on by the Ukrainians. So talk to guys, and we're watching them getting ready for an assault, and we can't do anything. Normally, you watch somebody getting ready to assault, you're calling an artillery on their heads. You're opening fire on them. You don't wait till they attack you. Here, we had to sit there and wait until they initiated contact, and then we can start firing back. That was the first 3 months of this conflict. So the Russian military is fighting with 2 arms behind its back and a leg tied there too, and a hood over its head at the very beginning, and still wiped out the majority of the Ukrainian force, the First Ukrainian Army. We're on version 4.0 right now, maybe version 5.0 now. Having said that, the other reason there was a lot of casualties, higher level of casualties, is because a lot of young commanders wanted to make a name for themselves. They thought this was going to be fast. This is going to be fast over. So, you've got to show the bravery and the glory to get the glory. So they were taking risks that, one, because of lack of experience, hot-headedness, and glory hounds. They were taking risks they shouldn't have been taking. And that gets people killed. Now it's everything's quite much more sober. It's not glory. There's enough, pardon my French, there's enough shit sandwich to go around for everyone. And this is not something that's going to end soon. So, okay. Let's go steady. We go right. We don't do any stupid heroics, and just wipe out the enemy. That's what needs to be done, and that's how it's being done now. Additionally, the Russian army, what Europe fails to understand is the mobilization capability of Russia. The partial mobilization, it was very partial mobilization. So the Russian reserve, this is anybody that's had any kind of military training. I'm not talking combat experience, but any amount of military. So people have gone through the 1 year call up or served under contract or longer, but what have you. From ages of 18 to I think like 50, 55 is 30 million. About 2% was what was called up. From that quantity, and of that, first and foremost, were people who were just off of contract or who had already been in combat. Syria, places like that. So they already had experience. They were still trained up, but you didn't need as much training for them. The ones that were just off contract, they were usually sent off to fill in the holes in some of these other units. The people that needed more training were sent to more training. Since then, it's primarily been not primarily. Since then, it's been volunteers. So about 30 to 40,000 volunteers a month. Some come in for patriotism, some come in for the money, whichever they come in. There are also still criminals that are being allowed in for a short list of criminal offenses. Murder's included. I'm not going to lie about it, but it's the type of murder. It's the I got in a bar fight and smacked a guy with a bottle on his head, or he got hit while they were drunk and he fell, hit his head and died. That's murder in Russia. That's first-degree murder or second-degree murder. So people, for those types of offenses, they're given a chance to redeem themselves. Now these guys are getting full training because about what most people will say right off the bat. Oh well, under Prigozhin and all that. And Prigozhin was recruiting from the prisons until he was forbidden to recruit from the prisons, because what Prigozhin was doing, building up his own fame on the corpses of these guys, because he wasn't giving them training in Wagner. There was Wagner, there were professional Wagner, and then there was these guys he was pulling from prisons. They weren't getting the training. He was just using them in body weights. And then screaming, oh, I'm not getting enough shells. He got more than enough shells. He had 120% of what he needed. And as somebody that has organized military convoys, heavy vehicle convoys, the fact that he said, it took me 30 minutes, we decided to go march on first on Rostov and then on Moscow. No, it doesn't work that way. Plus in Rostov, you saw how they went, everybody knew their location. This was practice. So this was a mutiny that he had already planned out. And he was just building off the corpse of these conscription guys. Why I'm saying this, people are still being conscripted. Well, not conscripted. They're still being given the opportunity out of convicts coming in for mostly thieves, white-collar crimes, things like that. And they can pay off their debt to society by fighting. But they are giving full training. I've been witness to where they were giving full training. I've been on these bases where they were being trained. Before they do any kind of assaults, they're trained for up to 3 months. Before they see any kind of combat. So, and normally the way you do it too is when you get green guys in, you get them into a quiet sector to get them acclimated because they're not. It's a different mentality. It's a different atmosphere. If nobody has been around, where artillery's booming and bullets are flying over your head, you want to get them acclimated slower than just throwing them into a meat grinder. So that's one of the options, but mostly it's volunteers. Officers, interestingly enough, a lot of a lot of officers that were my age, older, and have been out of the military. The military is not taking them back, and they're all being told your time hasn't come, which translates into there's probably going to be a big war, and then we'll take you all back when we start massing up on a large scale. So I think the military, at least from the military side, they're preparing for the big war with Europe. That they see the writing on the wall. I don't think all of Europe would go, but the Northern Europeans seem to be hell bent on their own destruction. So if they come to a fight, what are you going to do? So from that point, the Russian army's gotten much bigger and it's gotten much better. It's gotten experience, and they rotate units. So they'll have a battalion on the front, or a brigade on the front for half a year. Then they rotate it back, or depending where it may be on a battalion level rotation, they rotate it back for rest organization, and they'll put the next battalion up, and so on and so on. So nobody stays on there too long. Flip it to the Ukrainian side, which, by the way, Ukraine has opened 300,000 cases of desertion. That's the Ukrainian prosecutor's office has opened 300,000 cases of. That's the French and the British Army combined. just for for comparison, 300,000 cases of desertion. The problem for the Ukrainians now, it's the veterans are deserting. Because these guys have figured out there's never going to be a rotation back. The only way they leave the battlefield is either as a corpse or if they're wounded and maybe get carried out if they're lucky. Other than that, it's take your weapon and get the hell out. That's the only way out. So they're having a lot of problems, and that's the two systems. One is lost that leadership capability. The other one is building its leadership capability constantly. So you see the clash that's there. That's happening right now. Sorry for overwhelming.
No, I think what you've been talking about it's so important because it's somehow a new a fresh air to the whole information we have from the war in Ukraine. But when you mentioned, when we see somehow an economist being at the head of the Ministry of Defense of Russia, how that I remember when Vladimir Putin has decided to put him in that position, and everybody was talking about that this guy going to be a game changer. So far, how did you find his performance in his position, and how do you find the way that he's trying to deal with the conflict in Ukraine in terms of confronting all these Europeans? Because the war basically is an economic war. The war basically is on that front, because if you manage that, you can confront the military part. It's going to be in the hand of the commanders. But when you manage the situation, the economy part of the issue, the economy part of the conflict, then you have everything in your hand to manage. How did you find his position? I'm talking about the Ministry of Defense of Russia and his capabilities and his performance so far.
Any war that takes over more than a month, maybe 2 months, is a war of economies. Because you hit that replenishment point where you have to replenish not just men, but a lot of equipment. Some of the Europeans can't do, at least in their present state. The non-Russian Europeans. We own a third of Europe, so honestly, it's a pet peeve. Like, oh, the Europeans, yeah, we own a third of Europe. Keep going. The USSR, that's the proper term. All the worst of the Soviet Union, none of the best of the Soviet Union. They learned nothing good. They just only took all the bad parts and amplified those. It's an amazing thing to watch. Belousov, first of all, to understand, Belousov is a minister of defense. He does not form military strategy. He does not form military policy as far as on what happens on the battlefield. That's not his job. Gerasimov is in charge of the actual day-to-day combat operations, so on. He's the top. Well, the top, of course, of everything is Vladimir Vladimirovich. Minister, well, by the way, Belousov, unlike Shoigu, who was also a civilian, Belousov very rarely, if ever, puts on a military uniform. He has a general's rank, but it's an honorary rank. He is strictly a civilian person. Having said that, what very few are mentioning is Belousov is a very religious man. He's very active in the church. He works as an altarman. And if you know anything about Orthodox Christians, we get very strict on a lot of things, especially if you're somebody that's working the altar as an altarman. He's going to be he's got to be very, very religious on that. And why is that important? Religious people tend to be a lot less corrupt. That's just kind of how it goes. It's not to say that, if a couple gets married, the husband may not leave, but it's a lot more chance if they're just shacking up together, the guy may leave. There's a certain level of commitment. So if you got a religious man who's obviously religious, not making this for show, but has historically in his life as a religious person, he's much, much less chance of being corrupt, which means he's a straight shooter. And this is where he was brought in to straighten up the corruption that was in the different organs and get the economic policy running to support the military. And this, by the way, because 4 years in, how is 2% of the world GDP fighting off 40% of the world GDP? Well, very easy. Number one, Russia was never 2% of the world GDP. Russia was always much bigger. As somebody that I'm director of supply chain for large oil and gas services companies, I can tell you what happened early on when the Americans and the Western Europeans came into Russia after the Soviet Union collapsed. is they downgraded all of Russia's resources and industry in value. Why do you do that? And the thing is, from the Russian side, they didn't know the market value right off the bat. They had no idea. So, okay, all these experts are telling us, okay, well, maybe that's what we're really worth. There's no real price discovery. These guys just had no idea. They were listening to their American betters because they tell us everything that we know, blah, blah, blah. And what was really probably more like 6 or 7% of GDP was brought down as 2% of GDP. That's to begin with. And you do that because it's easier to buy things. Because if the guy thinks, he's got $100 worth of equipment and he only thinks it's worth $20, and you convince him it's not even worth 20, it's worth 15, hey, you just made a big killing on that buy. And that's how the system worked. But the problem is they convince themselves of that too. I'm talking about the Western portion. They convince themselves that Russia really is only that. Second of all, if you look realistically at economies, and look at the American economy, I will go ahead and count services into GDP, but I will cut out finance. The official finance portion of the American GDP is 21%. Unofficially, it's over 30%. So right off the bat, you take the American GDP and take a third off. It doesn't produce anything. It doesn't really give you any services. It produces debt. Russia's financial sector is that big in comparison. Russia has a huge manufacturing sector. That's something else that got ignored. Russia, just as an example, in 2025, Russia launched two different Russian companies launched two medium-range airliners into production that are 100% Russian parts. One of them was Superjet, which was being produced before, but it was being produced, a lot of the electronics and other sub-assemblies were being imported. 100% Russian manufacturing. Russia launched a new helicopter, civilian helicopter, 100% Russian manufacturing. Absolutely nothing is imported. Everything is locally mined, cut, built, produced, smelt, and 100% good. Europe can't do that. In fact, even Boeing couldn't do that and can't do it today. Boeing's biggest engineering office, their main engineering office, up to 2022 was in Moscow. Anybody doesn't believe it, look it up. Was in Moscow. They had over 700 engineers working in Moscow. Not in the US, not in the UK, but in Moscow. All of that's closed. Neither Airbus nor Boeing can build fully functional planes with just what's in the European Union or just what's produced in the US. They have to import. They have to import a lot. Russia builds Russia is literally a self-sustained economy on most things. It feeds itself quite well. By the way, it feeds about a third of the world too while we're at it. It's the biggest producer after China. It's the biggest producer of fertilizers, chemical and non-chemical fertilizer in the world, 65 million tons. Chinese, I think, are like 72. And Russia's growing at about 10% a year, 5 to 10% a year. It's the biggest exporter of fertilizer. It fed Europe with everything. That's the problem when they go, oh, well, they only gave us oil and gas. Well, no, they gave you diesel. They gave you plastics. They gave you wood products. BMW, Mercedes, and other companies were ordering steel and aluminum parts for their cars out of Russia. Paper, chemicals, base chemicals, more advanced compound chemicals, noble gases for the electronics industry, chipboards. I mean, you go down this list. I remember with the food items. Russia was the number one commodity and semi-assembled goods production center for all of the USSR economy. They cut everything. In fact, they're about to cut their final ties, which is funny, for uranium, processed uranium for the nuclear power plants. But anyway, Russia, 70% of the world's processing power for uranium. Okay, who are you going to go to? You don't have enough capacity at home. The Americans don't have capacity. Who are you going to go to? China? That's about the only other ones you can go to. The French have a good amount, but that's mostly internal use. So they cut everything off without noticing. There's the rest of the world that said, nah, screw off Europe. We'll continue trade with Russia. In fact, Russia can stand up to you guys. Oh, that means we can stand up to you guys. At least, standing with Russia. Oh, and we're all sick and tired of you. So all of a sudden, the global South went, you can stay in your garden. We'll stay in the jungle. We're free, not little animals in that zoo that's called Europe. And two, Russia is a self-contained economy if it really wants to be an economy. Why did Russia sell oil and gas to Europe? To get euros to buy other things from the Europeans. If you can't get euros and you can't buy anything with euros, you don't need those euros. So you don't really need to sell anything to Europe. And once you can't buy stuff that's already developed there and you start investing in your own R&D, well, once those investments are made, you no longer need anything. Just as a quick example, I know this has nothing to do with the military, but it's the way economies are running. A friend of mine was an IT director at one of the biggest paper mills in Russia. So they would send these giant rolls of semi-raw paper to Germany, those gigantic rolls that are like 4 meters wide. And then the Germans would process that and make office paper for the printers, cardboard and all that, and export that back into Russia. Part of it went into Russia, part to other countries. Well, the Germans cut everything off, by the way, which they also cut themselves off from paper. For German newspapers stopped printing because they had no paper. The Germans even had a bit of a shortage on toilet paper. Well, what did Russia do? Well, his company spent 2 years putting together 4 manufacturing facilities for cardboard. They manufacture 80% of Russia's cardboard in these 4 facilities. And the other 20% is manufactured in a couple other companies, their competitors. Are the Germans ever going to come back to this market? Never. It's gone. The market is closed forever for the Germans. And now a lot of these Europeans are in the delusion of, well, when this is over, we'll just walk back in. Well, one, a lot of your niches are closed, either by internal Russian manufacturing, China, Iran, Brazil, whomever is also taking their place. You're not coming back. 2, most Russians are pissed off. The Europeans, they're not going to let them come back. They don't want them back. A lot of people have got to see a lot of hatred in their direction over these years. So when you're dealing with these kinds of economies, and we've got a 4-year war, well, Europe can't manufacture. It doesn't have the raw resources. It doesn't have the raw energy. Russia does. And then behind Russia is China. China is Russia's deep rear. Russia is China's deep rear. Iran is the deep front for both, which defends, in fact, their backyards. So that's another country they cannot allow to falter, because if Iran falls, it opens up all their internal borders to penetration by the U.S. and NATO. That's basically an existential crisis for both Russia and China if something happens to Iran. You start pulling India into this orbit because the Indians suddenly realize that they're supposed to be the next wave of meat for the Americans to go fight the Chinese or something. That doesn't sound good. And all of a sudden you get the Eurasian continent, minus that little peninsula in the west that they call Europe, that you really can't beat because you're dealing with almost half the human population. And the majority, really, realistically speaking, the majority of the world industry. Now what do you do? And that's where we're at right now.